Maria stood in the grand hall, her heart racing as Lord Victor's cold eyes bore into her. She had never imagined this day would come. The life she once knew was slipping through her fingers, a life of privilege, of warmth, now reduced to shame. The words that had cut through her like knives echoed in her mind. "You are no longer welcome here." Carlos stood beside his father, his expression one of smug satisfaction. Maria's heart burned with humiliation, yet she knew she could not let her tears fall. As her eyes darted around the opulent room, memories of days spent in this very place threatened to consume her. But it was not only the cruel patriarch she faced, it was the weight of all those who had judged her. "You should have known your place," Lord Victor's voice rumbled. She wanted to scream, to tell them all the truth, but the words were choked in her throat. With a heavy heart, Maria turned to leave. The door closed behind her with an unforgiving finality. Her life had changed forever. Maria stood on the edge of the market, watching as the world passed by. Every face she saw was a reminder of the life she had lost and the emptiness of the life she now lived. The market bustled with noise, but Maria felt detached, as though she were a ghost moving through it. The rich colors of the fruits and vegetables, the chatter of the vendors, all seemed so distant. She focused on her task, arranging the produce with meticulous care, though her hands moved mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The whispers about her had started to die down, but she could still hear the occasional comment. It wasn't the same as before. She wasn't invisible, but she wasn't seen either. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Maria could feel the weight of the heat pressing down on her, much like the weight of her own thoughts. She wished she could be anywhere but here, in this moment, in this life. Rosa had heard the stories of what was happening to the family. She had seen the changes in Maria, the way her daughter had grown quieter, more reserved. And Rosa, though quiet herself, could not bear the weight of the unspoken truth any longer. The house they once lived in had become a prison, but even within that, Rosa had carried herself with dignity, silently suffering and silently protecting her daughter. Now, as she walked through their small home, the weight of her memories hung heavily around her. The past was never far from her mind, and neither were the sacrifices she had made. She had always given everything to her family. But now, as Maria struggled, Rosa could feel that her daughter was slipping away. There had been moments, fleeting ones, where Maria had been her bright, defiant child again. But those moments were fading, and Rosa could only watch in silence, knowing that there was little she could do to change their fate. The cold echo of Lord Victor's voice still rang in Maria's ears. She had heard it too many times before, but this time was different. The sting of his rejection was sharper, more final. "You are no longer welcome here," he had said. The words, once familiar, now felt like a death sentence. Maria's legs had shaken as she left the room, her body moving on instinct, but her mind was numb. She had walked down the grand hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the cold marble floors. Each step had felt heavier than the last, until she was outside, away from the suffocating weight of the mansion. She had hoped it would feel like a release, but instead, it felt like the world was closing in around her. The air outside was cool, but the weight of her emotions made it feel oppressive. She couldn't understand how everything had unraveled so quickly, but one thing was certain: she couldn't go back. She had been banished, and there was no going home. As Maria walked away from the mansion, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She hadn't expected to be cast out like this, not after all the years she had spent there. It wasn't just the loss of her home, it was the loss of her place in the world. She had been a part of something, once, and now she was nothing. The streets were unfamiliar, though they should have felt like home. She had spent years walking these same roads, but now they felt different, as though they belonged to someone else. The market, the sounds of the city, the smells of food and spices. They were all a blur. She couldn't escape the feeling that everything around her was fading into nothing. As she passed a familiar street corner, she saw a man watching her. At first, she didn't recognize him, but then the memories came rushing back. It was Samuel, the witness, the one who had seen everything and said nothing. His gaze was full of understanding, but there was no comfort in it. There was no way to undo what had been done. Maria turned away from him, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her life had been changed forever. Maria had found work in the market, but it was a life of struggle. Every day was a battle to survive, the weight of her past pressing on her. The laughter of children around her only reminded her of what she had lost, but she could not let despair win. She learned to move through the crowded market with a stoic expression, ignoring the stares of strangers. The scars on her hands were a testament to her work, but they didn't bother her. She had come to realize that the life she had now was all she could control. Her dreams of returning to the mansion were distant, though. Every reminder of that world only deepened her longing. As she carefully placed the fruits on her stand, Maria caught sight of a familiar figure passing by. Someone from the past, someone she thought she would never see again. It was Carlos, walking with the arrogance that had always marked him. He didn't notice her, and she didn't want him to. Carlos strolled through the market, his eyes scanning the crowd as though they were beneath him. His expensive clothes and polished appearance made him a stark contrast to the people around him. He felt powerful, untouchable, and his gaze was one of superiority. He had everything: wealth, status, freedom. He couldn't understand the anger that churned within him when he saw someone like Maria. She had been nothing but a reminder of his past mistakes. He had never truly cared for her, but his pride had always made him feel justified in treating her poorly. And now, here she was, beneath him in every way. Thought made him smirk. He couldn't help but feel victorious, though a small voice inside whispered that Maria was different, that she had an inner strength he could never understand. He quickly dismissed it. She was beneath him, nothing more. Rosa, Maria's mother, watched from the window as her daughter worked. Her heart ached for Maria, but Rosa was a woman of quiet strength. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions hidden. She had lived a life of silence, where words held no power, and her actions spoke louder than any cry for help. But seeing Maria endure this kind of hardship tore at her. She had always wished for a better life for her daughter, a life free from the burdens that weighed on their family. But that life was beyond their reach now. Rosa had made peace with it. She had to. Her eyes moved to the small altar in the corner of the room, where she said silent prayers for Maria's safety and strength. "Keep her strong, Lord," she whispered to the air. "She is more than this." Lord Victor had a way of manipulating those around him, and the servants were no exception. He ruled his household with an iron fist, every action calculated, every word a command. There was no room for disobedience, no space for weakness. His wealth and power were absolute. He had built his empire on the backs of people like Rosa and Maria. And yet, despite all his riches, Lord Victor felt something lacking. He could never relax, never fully enjoy the comforts his wealth afforded him. There was always a nagging fear, a deep, gnawing anxiety that someone might take it all away. He tried to dismiss the thought, but it never fully went away. And so he clung tighter to his power, to his control. The mansion, the servants, the wealth, it was all his, and no one would take it from him. The forgotten sibling, Damien, had always lived on the fringes, forgotten by the family that should have taken him in. Raised in secrecy, he had grown up with a sense of abandonment that had never left him. But that pain had turned into something more. It had turned into a driving force, a desire for revenge. He He had waited for years, watching the arrogance and cruelty of his family from a distance. He had seen their lavish lifestyle and felt the bitterness rise in his chest. But now he was ready to return. The time had come for Damien to confront the family that had disowned him. He would make them pay for the years of silence, for the years of rejection. He would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. Damien stood at the gates of the mansion, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been years since he had set foot here, and yet everything felt familiar. The grand marble pillars, the manicured gardens, the feeling of wealth that radiated from every stone. But there was no warmth in it anymore. This place that had once been his home had become a prison for his soul. The family that had disowned him, the family that had cast him aside, was still here, living in their gilded cage. Damien's mind raced with all the years of suffering he had endured in silence. He had lived without their love, without their care. But now he had come back, not as the forgotten child, but as the one who would bring their world crashing down. He took a deep breath and walked through the gates. His return would not be a quiet one. As Damien approached the front door, his mind raced with memories of his childhood. The warmth of his mother's embrace, the laughter of his siblings, memories now tainted by betrayal. The door opened and there stood the butler, a man who had once been a father figure to him. But now, the sight of him only reminded Damien of the life that had been stolen from him. The butler's eyes widened in surprise, recognition dawning too late. "Master Damien?" The old man stammered, his voice betraying a mix of confusion and fear. Damien nodded but said nothing. There was no need for words. The past had spoken for itself. He had returned, and nothing would be the same. Inside the mansion, Maria could feel a strange tension in the air. She had been moving through her daily routine, but something had shifted. The servants whispered among themselves, their conversations tense and hurried. Maria overheard a few words, fragments of a story she hadn't yet pieced together. It wasn't until she stepped into the grand hallway that she saw him, Damien. Standing tall, his posture defiant, he was a man transformed. His presence was undeniable. It was as though the years of suffering had forged him into something unrecognizable, something that demanded attention. Maria's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he was here, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood frozen, watching him with a mixture of confusion and intrigue. Damien's eyes met Maria's, and for a fleeting moment something stirred within him. He saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the same strength he had once admired in his mother. But now, it was tempered by years of hardship. Maria didn't speak, but Damien could feel her curiosity. His mind was racing. There was so much to explain, so much to reveal. But he wasn't here for explanations. He was here to take back what was stolen. He walked past her, his stride purposeful, heading towards the grand staircase where Lord Victor stood, watching with an air of superiority. "You've returned," Lord Victor's voice was cold, the tone laced with disdain. "Did you think we would welcome you with open arms?" The confrontation was inevitable. Damien had always known it would come to this. As he ascended the stairs toward Lord Victor, the memories of all the years he had spent in exile flooded his mind, but there was no turning back now. He stopped at the top of the stairs, facing Lord Victor. The patriarch's gaze was cold, but Damien could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. "What do you want?" Lord Victor's voice was sharp. "Revenge." Damien's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "No," he said softly. "I want justice." Damien's presence in the mansion had caused ripples through the household. But now, it was time for him to act. He had spent years plotting, waiting for the right moment to strike. And today, that moment had arrived. As he stood in the grand study, surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors, Damien felt a deep, almost ceremonial weight on his shoulders. This wasn't just about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from him. He had a plan, and it was one that would unravel the foundation of everything Lord Victor held dear. The curse he had learned about in his years of exile would be his weapon, a curse tied to the bloodline of the family. Damien knew the power it held, the way it could bring even the proudest patriarch to their knees. He whispered the ancient words that had been passed down to him, feeling the power surge within him. The air in the room grew cold, the temperature dropping as the walls seemed to close in. He had invoked the curse. The seeds of destruction had been planted. The air in the mansion grew thick with tension as Lord Victor felt a sudden chill. He stood in his private chamber, looking out the window, his thoughts clouded by the strange unease he couldn't shake. It was as though something in the house had shifted, something he couldn't control. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to his aging mind. But then he heard it, the soft whispering that seemed to come from nowhere. A voice that echoed in the corners of the room. "You cannot hide from the truth, Victor." The words chilled him to the bone, and he spun around, searching the room for the source of the voice. There was no one there. The room was silent, save for the distant sound of his heart beating in his ears. The air felt heavier, and for the first time in years, Lord Victor felt fear. The curse was already at work. Maria had no idea what was happening, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The servants were on edge, their whispers filling the hallways. She had seen Damien earlier, his presence still lingering in her mind. But now she was afraid. The mansion no longer felt like the home it once had been. It felt like a place of dark secrets and shadows, where something malevolent was stirring beneath the surface. As she walked down the corridor, she overheard a conversation between two servants. "There's something wrong," one said. "I can feel it in the air." The other nodded, eyes wide with fear. "It's the curse," she whispered. Maria stopped in her tracks. The curse. She had heard of it, but never believed it was real. Was it too late to stop it? Lord Victor's mind raced. He knew the whispers weren't just in his head. They were real, and they were growing louder. The mansion felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He rushed through the halls searching for answers, but the house seemed to shift around him, each corner darker than the last. His once indomitable presence felt small here, as though the weight of his past sins had finally caught up with him. He stopped in front of a large mirror, his reflection staring back at him with eyes filled with disbelief. What had he done? The curse was a tale told in hushed whispers, an old legend that was supposed to remain forgotten. But it had returned, and with it the certainty of his downfall. "I am not afraid of you," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. Damien watched from the shadows as the curse began to take its toll. The mansion, once a symbol of power, was now a place of terror. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the halls, was a sign that the curse was doing its work. Lord Victor, the mighty patriarch, was unraveling before his very eyes. But Damien knew this was only the beginning. The family would fall, piece by piece. Maria had already felt the first stirrings of fear, but soon she would understand the full extent of what was happening. The curse had a life of its own, and once it had begun, there was no turning back. Damien stood quietly, waiting for the inevitable collapse, knowing that the victory he had longed for was within reach. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The mansion, once full of life and light, now felt like a prison. The servants whispered more frequently, their eyes filled with fear as they went about their work. Maria tried to push the thoughts from her mind, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went, the air seemed heavier, colder. Even the walls seemed to close in on her, like they too were bearing witness to something dark and inevitable. Her gaze often drifted to Damien, who seemed to be everywhere, watching, waiting. His presence felt like a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong in her life. And yet, despite her fear, Maria couldn't help but be drawn to him. There was something in his eyes that told her he wasn't just here for revenge. There was something deeper, something even more dangerous, brewing beneath the surface. Carlos, too, felt the tension that had overtaken the mansion. His usual arrogance had been replaced with an unease he couldn't explain. Everywhere he went, there was an undercurrent of fear, a sense of impending doom. He couldn't understand it. What had Damien done? It wasn't just the curse that hung over them. It was something darker, something that made Carlos question everything he had taken for granted. He had always felt invincible, sheltered by his wealth and status. But now, for the first time, he felt vulnerable. Every conversation, every glance, seemed to hold a deeper meaning, as if the mansion itself were alive and watching them. Carlos tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at it. His family's control was slipping, and he didn't know how to stop it. Rosa had always known how to endure. She had spent her entire life hidden in the shadows, serving, waiting. But now, as the curse began to take hold, she felt a stirring deep within her. There was a strength inside her that had been lying dormant, a part of her that had long ago been buried under the weight of her responsibilities. For years she had been silent, watching from the sidelines as her family crumbled, but now she could no longer stand by. The curse was not just affecting the men in the house, it was affecting her too. She could feel it in her bones, the way the mansion seemed to be twisting, warping around them. Rosa had always known there would come a day when she would have to fight for her family's future. That day was now. Damien had anticipated the shift in the household, but it still felt satisfying to watch Lord Victor begin to unravel. The patriarch, once so sure of himself, now seemed like a shadow of the man he had been. Every conversation was laced with suspicion, every glance heavy with unspoken fear. The curse was taking root in his mind, eroding his confidence, and Damien couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. But this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The family had to be torn apart, piece by piece, before Damien could have his final reckoning. He was patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew that in the end, nothing would remain of the empire Lord Victor had built, and that thought brought him a strange sense of satisfaction. As the days passed, the tension in the mansion only grew. Maria felt the weight of the curse pressing down on her, and she couldn't escape it. The house that had once felt like a place of refuge now felt like a tomb. She had always known that there were secrets hidden here, things she was never meant to know. But now, those secrets were surfacing, and they were darker than anything she could have imagined. She began to see the cracks in the family's facade, the way Lord Victor's control was slipping, the way Carlos couldn't hide his growing fear. Even the servants who had once been so obedient now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes filled with uncertainty. It was as though the mansion itself was a reflection of the family's crumbling legacy, and in the midst of it all, Maria felt more alone than ever. The time had come for the final confrontation. Damien stood in the center of the grand hall, the place where it had all started. Lord Victor had summoned him, expecting to break him to assert his power one last time, but Damien knew better. The curse had already taken hold of the patriarch, and the power that had once seemed invincible was now crumbling. The mansion, once a symbol of strength, felt empty now, hollow, as if the walls themselves were collapsing inward. Lord Victor entered the hall, his face twisted with rage. "You've gone too far, Damien," he spat. "You think you can destroy everything I've built? This house, this empire, it's mine." But Damien stood tall, unwavering. "It was never yours to begin with," he replied, his voice steady. "This empire was built on lies and blood. Now it's time for it to fall." And with that, the final battle between father and son began. As the two men faced each other, The air seemed to hum with tension. Lord Victor's pride had always been his greatest weapon, but it was now his greatest weakness. The years of cruelty, of controlling everything and everyone, had left him isolated. There was no one left to support him. Damien knew this was his moment. "You never cared about family," Damien said, his voice rising with anger. "You cared about power, and now you will watch it slip through your fingers." Lord Victor's face turned pale, the color draining from his cheeks as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. "No," Lord Victor whispered, his voice cracking. "I am not weak," but the words rang hollow. He could no longer deny the truth. Everything he had built was crumbling around him. The curse, once a distant legend, now fully manifested in the form of the family's unraveling. Damien watched as Lord Victor's world crumbled around him. The patriarch had always believed that wealth and power would shield him from consequences, but now the weight of his sins was bearing down on him. His grip on the mansion was slipping, his empire collapsing. The servants who had once obeyed him without question now looked at him with pity and fear. Carlos, who had once believed he was invincible, now stood in the doorway, his face filled with shock and disbelief. "What's happening?" he whispered. "What have you done?" But Damien didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Lord Victor had lost everything, and there was no turning back. Damien stepped forward, his eyes locked on Lord Victor. "You're finished," he said, his voice cold and final. Lord Victor, trembling, reached out as though to grab hold of something, anything to regain his power. But there was nothing left. The curse had stripped him of everything, and now he was nothing but a shell of the man he had once been. Maria, who had been watching from the doorway, felt a surge of emotion. She had seen the cruelty Lord Victor had inflicted on her and her family, and now she felt the weight of the curse settle on him. It wasn't justice. It was simply the price he had to pay for all the lives he had destroyed. The silence that followed felt heavy, the tension between father and son palpable. Damien had won, but at what cost? The final moments felt like an eternity. Lord Victor collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he looked up at his son, the weight of his failures crashing down on him. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to protect us." But Damien's expression didn't soften. "You were never trying to protect anyone," he replied, his voice steady. "You were only protecting yourself." And with that, the curse that had begun so many years ago reached its devastating conclusion. Lord Victor had lost everything, and in the end, there was nothing left but the ruins of his legacy. The mansion stood silent, its once gleaming walls now worn with time and the weight of betrayal. Maria, standing in the remnants of what had been her home, felt a quiet sense of closure, though it was not the freedom she had hoped for. The air was thick with the memories of what had come before, of Lord Victor's cruelty, of Damien's vengeance. And now, here she was, standing alone amidst the ruins of their past. Damien had won his battle, but Maria knew that this victory had come at a steep price. The world around them was different now, but so was she. "It's over," Damien said, his voice soft yet final as he stepped up beside her. His presence, once a source of dread, now felt like a calm in the storm. Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and acceptance. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Damien didn't reply at first, but his gaze softened, as though he too was questioning the aftermath of it all. The destruction was not just physical. The mansion, with all its wealth and grandeur, had become a hollow shell, a reflection of the family's fall from grace. Carlos, who had once been so full of arrogance, was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared, unable to bear the weight of what had happened. The servants, once loyal to Lord Victor, had quietly left as well, no longer willing to live under the shadow of the curse. Maria could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just the walls of the mansion that had changed, it was the entire foundation of their world. She walked through the rooms, touching the remnants of what had been. The once pristine furniture, now covered in dust, felt like a ghost of a life she had left behind. She knew the family had been broken, but now, in the stillness, she could feel that everything, even the air itself, was different. The freedom she had longed for had come, but with it came the weight of what had been lost. Rosa had spent her life in silence, but now she found herself speaking her truth. As Maria walked through the remains of the mansion, Rosa stood beside her, a steady presence. She had watched so much crumble, so much break, and yet she had never allowed herself to give up. She had carried the weight of their family's past, their suffering, but now she could finally let it go. "It's time for something new," Rosa said softly, her voice filled with quiet strength. Maria turned to her mother, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "But how do we begin again?" Maria asked. Rosa looked at her with a smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "Together, we rebuild one step at a time." The words were simple, but Maria felt their power. She realized then that rebuilding wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about forging something new, something that would carry them forward. The mansion, though physically standing, had become a relic of the past. It no longer held the power it once had. The curse, which had been the catalyst for so much destruction, had ultimately freed them from the tyranny of Lord Victor's reign. Maria and Damien stood together in the grand hall, now empty and still. The grandeur of the space had faded, leaving only the bare bones of what had been. "What now?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. Damien glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Now, we decide," he replied. "We decide who we want to be." Maria nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The past had taken its toll on them both, but the future was theirs to shape. They could build a life, a new beginning, free from the shadows of what had come before. The final step was taken as Maria walked away from the mansion, leaving the past behind. Her steps were steady now, no longer burdened by the weight of what had been. She was walking into a new life, one that she would build for herself. The curse that had haunted the family for so long was finally over, and with it came a quiet sense of peace. Maria didn't know what the future held, but she knew she would face it with the strength of all that she had endured. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. She had broken free from the chains of the past, and the road ahead was open, waiting for her to walk it. And as she took that first step, she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. The future was hers.